Well, President Cyril Ramaphosa says that the ANC's National Executive Committee, lekgotla, has resolved that government should look at imposing a national state of disaster over our energy crisis and the situation at Eskom. You remember, of course, how the state of national disaster legislation was used by government during the COVID-19 pandemic and led to the hard lockdown. Obviously, no one is suggesting that will happen again, but it could give government more powers to deal with this crisis. Well, that's the thought. Professor Dewald from Niekerk is the head of the African Centre for Disaster Studies at the Unit of Environmental Sciences and Management School for Geo and Spatial Sciences at Northwest University. Professor, good afternoon to you. What kind of powers would the National Disaster Act give government in a situation of a power crisis like this one?
Good afternoon, Stephen. Good afternoon, viewers. I think we are all well aware of the far-reaching powers under the state of disaster, especially enforced by the Disaster Management Act. So as with any other particular hazard that might lead to disaster or that we would classify as a disaster, whether it's on whichever level of government, it gives government and specifically the executive quite far-reaching powers to implement different regulations to bypass certain laws and regulations in order to combat and to mitigate the effects of the phenomenon which we sit with. So in order to use the Disaster Management Act, in this case, will definitely give them far-reaching powers. However, we need to be asking the question, is the Disaster Management Act the correct law to be used in this situation? And I certainly feel that it is absolutely not the intent of the Disaster Management Act. The amount of power that it provides government, and especially the ANC government, and we've seen with COVID and the different absolute absurd regulations that we see, I don't think this is the right piece of legislation to use. And I think there must be better measures to be implemented in this case.
Is it back to, in a way, the same problem we had during the pandemic? The disaster legislation was really conceived, the whole idea behind it was to deal with something like a flood or a cyclone or something like that, a sort of once-off event, not a long-term problem.
Absolutely. What we tend to forget is to read the Disaster Management Act in conjunction with the National Disaster Management Framework, which is actually the official policy and the implementation of the Disaster Management Act. Nowhere in the framework will you find a mention of an electricity crisis or Eskom as an identified hazard. So within disaster studies, there's a natural progression of events. So we will start with something like a hazard, whether it's natural or anthropogenic. And if it exceeds our ability to cope with it, this escalates into what we would call a disaster. In this case, we need to ask ourselves, what is the hazard? And it's very difficult under the Disaster Management Act to justify what we are sitting with as something that we would conceive as a disaster. Now, using this term disaster in the normal English language gives us a sense of urgency. And we should not confuse the two of just saying that a situation is a disaster to what a state of disaster means within our national legislation. The Disaster Management Act is extremely specific in Section 1 and 2 to say that if we have adequate legislation to deal with a situation, then the Disaster Management Act does not function. We can't do much under the Disaster Management Act. As soon as something exceeds our ability to cope, then it becomes an issue. Now what we currently sit with is a self-imposed crisis by an inept governing party that tries now to use these special regulations and law to justify certain measures. And I'm asking myself, what are they exactly saying? This crisis was created by a certain government structure. Now they are saying, well, we need extraordinary measures to fix what we've done, yet we don't acknowledge the fact that we have done this. Are they saying that, okay, well, we are acknowledging the fact that we're actually competent to govern? It becomes a very silly circle argument that they could implement to use the Disaster Management Act. And I believe if we look at what has transpired since I would say probably July last year, where President Ramaphosa implemented or said they're going to implement certain measures, the question remains, what more can government do under a state of disaster than what it can't do now or what it is trying to do now? So many people would say, well, they can implement certain procurement measures and bypass procurement measures and access a contingency reserve. And I'm asking myself the question, what money? Where does this money all of a sudden come from that people think is this golden pot lying around and we can automatically just access billions and billions of rands to fix a problem? Why haven't we done this in the past 17 years with issues with the national power provider? This is not an issue under the Disaster Management Act, and this is certainly not a state of disaster nationally, as can be declared under the Disaster Management Act.
There's certain technical questions I just want to sort of have a quick look at, if I may. I presume if Eskom's management's been complaining about red tape, you would be able to use the National Disaster Act to get around some of that. If I recall, during the pandemic, for example, it went against competition law for private hospitals and government hospitals to work together, but they were allowed to do that. Would that be the case here?
Oh, certainly. I mean, under the state of disaster, you can do quite a lot of things which are positive and negative when it comes to the current energy crisis. But what we must be aware of, we're entering a situation where we are using emergency and disaster law to do a normal management and governance function. And that, in a democracy, must raise quite a number of red flags. I'm absolutely amazed that the DA would also jump on the bandwagon and call for a ring-fence state of disaster. I've never in my life heard of anything like that. The law does not make provision for something like this. We must acknowledge the fact that we have a crisis. The government must probably stop thinking that all South Africans are stupid. It is quite common sense we sit in the situation where we are in, and we should use the current measures that we have in place. This is a technical management government problem that we sit with, and nobody's going to convince me that a state of disaster all of a sudden is going to provide the ideal situation where in the next 11 months we're going to fix load shedding. Really.
Professor. Would a state of national disaster allow you to ignore environmental law? And let me be very clear what I'm saying here. There's been a lot of talk in the last little while around the car power ships, the Turkish company that would provide electricity through liquefied natural gas, through ships that would dock at our ports on, first we were told a 20-year contract, then a 10-year contract at an unbelievable cost, over 220 billion rand over 20 years. Would you be able to overrule environmental legislation using a national lockdown? I mean, excuse me, a national state of disaster.
State of disaster, yes, you can absolutely do that. That's why the law is there. So you can invoke these extraordinary measures to solve the problem. Now, like I said, there's positive and negative elements if you look at the possibility of a state of disaster. For instance, the ability of private providers to quickly link to the national grid, for private citizens to generate additional electricity, for the car power ships to come on board, I have even had people say stuff like stopping coal exports. There's really a lot that you can do on a state of disaster, but it comes back to this question of intent. That is not what the intent of the Disaster Management Act was for. Now, if we go through this situation, it opens up the possibility of local municipalities to declare local states of disasters for something like potholes. Because we are in it, this is to us, we see this as a disaster, therefore we invoke the Disaster Management Act for this. I say then you are actually going into a much bigger crisis where government can literally do whatever they want to. And I don't even think this is not what the Disaster Management Act was intended to be used for and why we have it in place. We never ever had discussions around using this for normal day-to-day management problems of government. If that is the case, we're not a democracy anymore. Then we can just as well give all power over to the ruling party and we can sit back and see what else they can do. This is certainly not what the Disaster Management Act was meant to do.
We may soon also have a cabinet reshuffle, and we remember how suddenly we understood that the Cooperative Governance Minister has quite a lot of power during a lockdown. The regulations are signed in her name, although, if I remember correctly, they're also made by Cabinet as the official body. And in fact, there's a court case now around whether or not all of the decisions and the reasons for the decisions have to be made public or not, or whether they are in fact confidential. But never mind that for the moment. If a state of national disaster is declared, and I presume that's signed into law by the COGTA Minister, and the COGTA Minister changes through a reshuffle, does that affect anything?
Easy answer, no, because there's supposed to be continuity within government. If there's a reshuffle of, let's say, portfolios and ministries, the Disaster Management Act is still in place because it says a minister responsible for disaster management. And so that minister, the president, can say, well, the minister in the presidency becomes responsible for disaster management. So I don't think the continuity is the problem here. The problem is that the Disaster Management Act follows a two-pronged approach before we can declare state of disaster. The first is the classification and the recording of it through Section 23. Then there's a declaration through Section 27. Now, the classification and recording, or just the classification of it, must be done by the head of the National Disaster Management Center. It's very, very specific. So the head of the center must inform the minister that would say, after a thorough investigation and a thorough risk assessment, we've come to the conclusion that we sit within a situation of possible disaster or we sit in disaster. Therefore, under these reasons, I would urge you to declare a state of disaster. I cannot see that the head of the center would possibly do that. It's a very technical thing. It relates to something of disaster risk, which I already said the poor management of a certain entity in government falls outside of this. I don't think the head of the National Disaster Management Center would be doing his job properly if he allows a classification of this nature.
Sure. Professor, thank you very much indeed. Professor Philip Niekerk is the head of the Department of Disaster Studies at the University of Northwest. Very interesting there. It does raise a couple of questions, of course. If there is no declaration from the centre, what happens then, despite what the ANC has said it wants to happen?